Hello, welcome to my explanation of the music and arranging that went into a piece I wrote in college called Kiln. It's part of a score for a fictional movie, as in a movie that does not exist. But the movie's 5 scenes, of those 5, the third one is scored by me in this piece. So without further ado, let's listen to it and then I'll explain some stuff afterwards. I haven't listened to this in a long time. Um, but it's not bad. Not bad for my very first orchestral composition ever. For some context, I wrote this for my orchestration class at Cal Poly. Dr. Antonio Barada assigned this as our term project to make a piece that's at least 3 minutes long using orchestral instruments and style. Dr. Barada's personal preference was for a more modern composing style, so that's why this doesn't sound like a legitimate symphony. And I am not a legitimate composer, so there's also that. Let me now read my foreword to the printed score, my composition notes. Ergame is a fictional film, that follows an interstellar alien refugee as he seeks haven on a distant planet. Warfare and fanaticism plague his hostile new home, and amid this dangerous milieu, several pivotal film scenes were selected for handcrafted scoring. All of those pieces should evoke the friction between people, the fear for safety, yet the tenacity of soul. Scene 3 is written like this: a scene depicting the welcome intervention of a stranger who helps our protagonist through a difficult situation. a group ganging up against the protagonist as he tries to transact some simple business. A bond is formed. So my composition begins with the protagonist attacked in the public quarter. An unexpected and daring chase ensues with a piano bass line and its accompaniment evoking a dash towards safety. With the protagonist safe in a hiding spot, and as the all too familiar danger dies away like it always does, a lone flute prolongs the moment and the protagonist meets a native to the planet. An amicable native, a primitive one, and unsettlingly simple. For a moment, the two parties are quite wary of the unexpected other, yet they engage in some kind of exchange and realize they both share a badge of oppression. A march-like chorus captures this feeling of meeting someone new whom you've somehow known for a long time. But alas, a chat is not a conversation until it turns serious. Ergame's fear motif hangs over the two characters' heads like a parasite that can't be drowned out by any dialogue or orchestration efforts. A weary complaint about the fearmongers on the present planet quickly becomes a heated and impassioned. Soon another motif surfaces as incongruously as any other kind of dissonance. It's imperceptible at first, but reinforced in the contrabass and the trombone sections. It is the hatred motif, ugly yet natural. Two is always better than one, and rather than become an echo chamber, the character's tiny hole becomes a place of processing what they feel to one another, and feeling compassion for each other's circumstances and for the other's assorted loved ones. As the kiln motif returns, we are reminded that bonds do not form in a vacuum, but rather they are forged by the very pressing struggles of life that seek to incinerate and crush us. Like alloy is to a metal in an oven, so too does a friend become incorporated and strengthen us. If you don't know, kiln is a synonym for oven. So the theme of coming into contact with somebody and melting into them and blending with them and developing among them, that theme runs along this piece everywhere and plays into its name. So let's get into it. I'm going to split up my comments into two categories. The first being musical aspects that I wrote in order to convey the narrative of the scene. Much of that you heard in the foreword just now, but I'll be getting into a lot more detail. The second category are musical aspects that I incorporated to make the piece cohesive, to make it musically impressive, to make the piece fit in with the rest of the score. Really anything that had attention put into it by me, but it didn't involve the narrative of the movie. I'm going to leave that second category just for the comments for the sake of time, the comments of this video, so you can read them if you're interested. But right now we'll be getting into that first category, musical aspects that fit into the narrative. Let's look at section A first, the introduction. You're blasted at first with timpani and bass drum. The scene opens abruptly with the percussion section as if the protagonist's attention is leveraged from being vague to pointed. So imagine the movie has been going on for a while and our protagonist, let's call him Paul. Paul is buying watermelons at the market. He's grocery shopping. So his attention is only vaguely directed at the things going on around him. But in the same way that these percussion instruments come out of nowhere and they catch the audience's attention, especially the suspended cymbal crescendo right here. In that same way, something catches Paul's attention, makes him, drop his watermelon. The thing that catches his attention is found in the horns, the trombones, and the bass trombones. 3 double forte notes in the brass section that ascend, get reinforced in the string section with a sforzando here. There's sustained notes, crescendo, and accent on the downbeat of the next section. The sforzando plus the high string trills here for second violins, coupled with the unison brass, is supposed to suggest sudden hazard. A racist gang interrupts Paul while he's grocery shopping. Let's listen to the introduction again. So yeah, the intro is in a minor key because this is not a very pleasant experience for Paul to be having while he's grocery shopping. He doesn't want to have to deal with this kind of noise again. It's just a Tuesday, he's running errands, and all of a sudden he has to deal with racism just because he's an alien from another planet. He ain't having it. In the next section, after Paul's initial surprise, he has to run for his life. I mean, as old as this kind of racist interaction is, it's still very dangerous. Like he could get beat up, he could get all inched. It's dangerous, Paul needs to leave. This piano ostinato here represents the protagonist fleeing from that gang, fearing for his life. The ostinato as in the repeated background melodic figure that the piano is playing right here. Among orchestrators, I'd say I'm pretty heavily influenced by video game soundtracks instead of legitimate classical music. And this piano part is supposed to capture a daring chase sequence with all of the 16th notes and the bass clef, left-handed piano figure. The ostinato is alone during the first couple of measures here, and I did that so that there would be a kind of tunnel vision effect that mirrors the tunnel vision from Paul's adrenaline rush. When Paul enters this fight or flight response mode, and he drops his watermelon, he's only focused on getting away and, saving his own hind. So there's a bit of a tunnel vision in the score right there too. Now, later in the section, starting in this measure here, the dissonance that's been building up to this point in the section, especially in the 4-part round between the bassoon, the bass clarinet, the trombones, that dissonance reaches its pinnacle right here. It's as if the protagonist's flight just might end unsuccessfully. So Paul's been running and running and running. He's trying to evade those chasing him as best as he can. And it seems that they're really close to catching him and beating him up. And that extreme danger and heightened sense of thrill is expressed by the severe dissonance and brassiness right here among all of these brass section parts in this measure. But at last, the crazy dissonance and excitement comes to an end here. There is a piccolo descant along with subtle strings and a ritardando to indicate a sigh of relief as Paul lives to see another day. What he does is he hides in an alley and the gang passes by without seeing him. So Paul actually gets away from the people chasing him, thankfully. He's got plot armor, he's hiding in an alley, and the sustained strings represent a kind of soothing breath returning to Paul. He doesn't have to catch his breath anymore. The slowing tempo represents a slowing heart rate, and this piccolo really up high is kind of like a beacon of hope. It's very short and small, but it's so high that it's like a beacon of the bright hope that Paul can get back to his family. That's it for the B section. Let's listen to it again. You'll be able to hear the chase at the beginning, the extreme danger heightening and heightening, and then the return to calm as Paul comes back to safety. At the end of that section, the movie camera should be on Paul's face, and his face carries a kind of tiredness. The kind of tiredness from having to just deal with this harassment so consistently. To the audience, they just saw their hero survive and they're excited for him, but for Paul, this sort of thing happens all the darn time, and it's lost its excitement to him long, long, long ago. He starts leaving to go back to his groceries, and the score seems to be wrapping up as well. It sounds like it's about to, this piece is about to end. The scene should have ended with the protagonist safe, but a lone flute sustains through the bar line, showing that the protagonist still has more to pay attention to. It's just one instrument in the entire orchestra that's playing, and it's holding on to the scene like a single tiny thread. That thread could represent Paul's attention to the things surrounding him. He's already trying to remember what his errands are and if he'll be able to come back home on time. But Paul isn't going to return to his groceries just yet. There's a new section, so stick around. A furtive cello comes out of the silence and says, hello. This cello blatantly represents one character in the scene in many ways. Let's call that character Freddie. Freddie is a native to the planet, and he looks nothing like Paul. I think in my foreword I said his shape is kind of simplistic. He was hiding in the alley first, and so he's the one who reaches out to Paul and says hello to him. But then a wary clarinet responds to the cello with, is someone there? The clarinet, of course, personifies Paul and his cautious response. In this tiny little couple of measures, the response continues between those two characters. They gradually become less and less cautious, as shown by the increasing number of notes that the instruments play. if you follow along what the cello is doing for the rest of this piece, or what the clarinets are doing for the rest of this piece, then it's in general supposed to parallel Paul and Freddie. So it turns out that the cello was building up these notes as part of none other than a full motif, the first motif introduced in the piece, and the only motif in Kiln that doesn't show up in the rest of the movie's score. It's called Kiln, so it's the eponymous motif, and it represents camaraderie. It's primarily in the cello, but you can hear it doubled in the brass horn and the English horn. The notes of this motif were actually chosen to accentuate this entire march section that you hear, and it encapsulates friendship itself, a blossoming friendship that's just starting, but that feels so natural as it progresses. So the motif plays during the next major section of the piece. The climactic entrance of the entire symphony parallels the climactic first meeting between Paul and his new friend. Their now turned friendly conversation feels and sounds like meeting a stranger that you somehow feel you've known forever. This is the most consonant section of the piece. It's the most pleasant sounding. It sounds all nice and march-like, and it represents that first conversation Paul and Freddie have ever had. It's one of those you, me too conversations. I mean, have you guys ever had a conversation like that where you realize there was actually a second version of you floating around there somewhere in the world, and it's just now that you've come in contact. This is the first friend that Paul's been able to make on this planet, and for Freddie, he hasn't been the most social butterfly either because he's ugly and he just looks so simple, so unbecoming. But here, finally, neither of them are alone anymore, and I wanted this music here to be as uplifting as that kind of feeling. Consonant, straightforward chord progression, and yeah. In the middle of the section, the triumphant trumpet proclaims the second motif of hope. After finding a new friend, hope that the current discrimination and struggle will not last. It's doubled in the piano and a syncopated oboe. So starting from here, all the remaining motifs are ones that you'll find in the rest of the movie score, like in my classmates' compositions. So of course, hope would have to show up in my piece because Paul's and Freddie's friendship is what's going to bring them to the end of the movie, and their hope for what they can do together. Going to bring to the end of the movie, but that's a spoiler, though. This section ends with a deceptive cadence because, unfortunately, the happy fun time conversation can't last forever. Before we get into that, let's listen to the section. You can hear the lingering moment with the introduction to each other and then the entirety of the cathartic meeting. At this point, their conversation turns to our character's current location. They're in an alley hiding, and they're here because they're hiding from oppressors. Paul remembers that fact, and he remembers the groceries he had to leave behind because of that. So my next motif sneaks in, piercing through in the piano, a motif of fear which shows up in the rest of the movie. Almost by surprise, the characters' friendly chat takes a turn for the fearful. Another motif, sneaking into the symphonic ocean like a pollutant. It's doubled and offset in the bass clarinet and the trombones, and further repeated 4 times in different variations. Just as fear itself can take different variations and look like separate things. By variations, I mean the motif looks different in a certain way. It's kind of complicated to explain it further than that. But what's important is it's still recognized as the motif of fear every time it shows back up. Aside from where that motif shows up, the rest of the orchestra is playing some pretty discontinuous stuff. Most of the sparse orchestration in this section represents the characters' unsuccessful efforts to avoid succumbing to the fear and anxiety they feel as residents on their planet, and our unsuccessful efforts to drown out the fear motif as the listeners. You can kind of think of the small musical ideas here that aren't really connected. There's a lot of rests. You can think of them like attempts by Paul and Freddie to bring their conversation back to where it was, the pleasantries. But that fear motif here is just so insidious, and it sticks out so much to us because it's in the piano, which has a very particular timbre, just as much as it sticks out to them. As an example of that, the Kiln motif, the friendship anthem that I built, tries to insert itself in the cello right here, but despite its best efforts to divert attention from the fear motif as the characters try to ignore their own fears, the odd triplet rhythm placement renders this effort ill-fated. In the next measure, a defeated English horn will attempt the same motif to even worse success. By the end of the section, the conversation loses a great deal of hope. The last few measures here, dominated by mutations of the fear motif, and the characters break down in anxiety regarding their safety and livelihood on this antagonistic planet. All of the worries that they have to struggle with, that Freddie and Paul have been dealing with for much of their life now, it just gets to them and begins an unhealthy portion of their conversation. There's not much hope and positivity in it. It's reflected in a really intimidating arrangement, but before we get into that, let's listen to this section with that fear motif coming in, the variations on that, and the declining texture of the whole orchestra. All right, here we're getting into the beginning of the climax to the piece. Down here in the low strings, the final motif to be introduced is a contrabass ostinato, which crescendos molto a molto from imperceptibly soft to deafening. It's the motif of hatred and the most hate-filled timbre that I could think of besides the piccolo. Low strings. The characters' conversation has taken a dark turn, and although they haven't recognized it yet, they hate the state of their planet. So this motif here is gnarly, like it's meant to represent what's evil and wicked in the planet, like the very worst aspects of the planet, and by extension, our planet Earth, but that's talk for another more political day. By making the motif going from silent, right here, triple P, to deafening by the end of this section, it's hard for the listener to tell when the motif actually enters their perception. Just like it's hard for Paul and Freddie to realize the moment they've lost control of their emotions and they're just shooting off at the mouth at this point how much they detest the people who live on this planet and the actions of the people who live on this planet and how they hate everything and wish that it would all just be eliminated. Like it's some pretty heavy stuff and a lot of unkind words and a lot of cursing. And over here, a melody is repeated in the first clarinets and the tuba, but it's not the same melody every single time. It changes every 2 measures because the piece changes keys every 2 measures in this section. The character's hate-filled conversation devolves into example after example of things wrong with the people on this planet. Those modulations happen in relative rapid fire every 2 measures because Paul and Freddie are livid, yelling out things that are negative and that they don't enjoy in rapid fire as well. They're just complaining. And honestly, let's listen to this hateful section and you can try and exercise. Pick out any instrument, try to listen to what it's doing in this section. I can almost guarantee that what it's doing is a musical representation of hatred or feeling upset or feeling like your world has no foundation or feeling like things are upside down and can't get a foothold, something along those lines. that part sounds like it was written by a crazy person because I was quite literally crazy while I was writing much of this. It was late at night, and I had to write this to complete a homework assignment. So I was done with trying any longer. So you're hearing the music written by a sleep-deprived man. But here we are at the last section. The hate motif, it's still blasting in the final section, just as it's hard to let go of hateful or otherwise negative emotions. So it's nearing the end of the piece. The characters aren't just going to immediately drop their emotions, though. People often hold on to hatred more naturally than they do to positive feelings, even. So the first few measures here are still characterized by that hate motif in the bass at a double forte. But something began in this section. A decidedly major tonality demonstrates what truly wins in the battle between hatred and forgiveness. If by major tonality I mean positivity and hope, the orchestra is playing that. They're playing major chords and they're grounded in something. There's no more crazy fast key changes, and the sound is honestly kind of reminiscent of the earlier friendship section. This polyphonic ostinati texture in the first and second violins is super duper major key and is very, very hope filled. So all of that major stuff is supposed to represent a battle that has just been waged against the negativity and the evil that can kind of be encapsulated by what the bass is doing here. So stay tuned to see how that battle will go. If we return to the cellos, the Kiln motif actually returns successfully to bookend the piece in the same part that introduced it, the cello and now the harmonized English horn. Finally, the delicate pizzicato ostinati between the first and second violins and in the piano conclude my piece by saying that good may not be very heavy, but it's still powerful. So if you just listen to the bass motif decrescendo and decrescendo until it's eventually so soft and imperceptible, all we're left with is simple and basic orchestration. I'm going to play this finale section, and after that, I'm going to end the video, but just picture in your mind the conversation between Paul and Freddie. It reached a climax with them shouting out detestable things about this planet's inhabitants, and the things they're saying are pretty similar to the insults hurled at them by the planet's inhabitants. They're just reflecting and mirroring what's wrong with the planet. The two of them realize that things can't get better this way. This eye for an eye, tooth repaid for with a tooth method. They think about their families, about their loved ones, and how the only thing that can overcome the injustice in their world is forgiveness and goodness of all the individuals. I hope this tiny song that I wrote can convey that message, which Paul and Freddie learned, to the people of our own planet Earth as well. But if not, then I had a fun time learning about orchestrating by writing it. Yeah, I think that's about it. Thanks for watching, everybody.